Hello everyone. Welcome to this podcast by Center for Political Leadership of VM Sargavkar College of Law. This is your host Siddhesh Tari, Assistant Professor at VM Sargavkar College of Law. So today we are going to look at Russia-Ukraine conflict and more specifically at Vladimir Putin about his style of politics. And in this podcast, we will try to decode the personality of Vladimir Putin. Okay, who is the central figure in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and when we had made the announcement about this podcast, we had invited questions from students, academicians, and general public. So we would like to take up some of those questions with our guest. And today we have here with us Mr. Shailesh Tanpure, who is a keen observer of international relations and he works as a writer at a popular news media platform in shorts. So Shailesh, why don't you introduce us to the topic?
Uh, First of all, thanks a lot for having me here. I thank the Center for Political Leadership for organizing this. And so, getting on with the topic, essentially, uh, we were trying to sort of analyze what was rational behind Putin in whatever he's done in Ukraine, and where he's coming from with that kind of a move, and what has been his reaction to whatever the reaction has been so far from the world. So we know that on 24th February, Indians woke up to the news that Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and what they did was essentially sort of start a war that was uh, much anticipated on the world stage, and the West reacted in the most prominent way it could. And fortunately, not a lot of people got involved in the conflict, which would have increased the violence. But as it is, the conflict is pretty violent. So we see a lot of disturbing images coming out from Ukraine. So essentially, I don't want to get into the details of the conflict because pretty much we are aware of what's happened. And I would say when you look at what's happened from where Putin is coming, it seemed like a natural response for him, because in the past, in Chechnya, in Georgia, he's taken this kind of a militaristic approach to resolving issues rather than pushing for diplomacy. So yeah, I think we can get on with the questions now.
Okay, so the first question is from Professor B.S. Patil. He's saying that the attack by Big Brother is a part of recent history. Okay, so how come attack by USA is to save democracy and humanity, and attack by Russia is an act of aggression? So what do you think?
So essentially, when you say act of aggression, now why is that aggression taking place? When you look at it, when you actually dissect it from a Russian perspective, is the aggression meant as an offensive or a defensive? So essentially, that's what this is. So what Putin has said is, Ukraine in its current form, and its under the current leadership has uh, come to become a threat to Russia and Russians that reside in the country. So his recognition of those two independent states, his move in Crimea, he's justified it by saying as a measure of protection towards the Russians. So he's sort of uh, become the champion of Russians, in the sense that wherever they face a threat, he is going to be the one to respond. And if it means invading a country and basically getting isolated by the entire or the most of the world around him, he's willing to pay that kind of a price. So that's essentially what this is, as far as aggression goes. So, and essentially messaging, like you must know that a lot of the popular media is headquartered in the West. So whatever perspective they push is the dominant perspective in the media, and that sort of forms the opinion of the masses. So because the media is mainly based in the West, their perception which says this is an act of war is unjustified, or whatever it is undemocratic. So essentially, that's what people are perceiving it as. If maybe the tables were turning, and the media from these kind of countries like Russia, pariah states, were having some sort of a dominant thing. Their messaging would get prominence. So that's essentially what it is.
So the second question is from Sankalp Gaonkar. Okay, he's saying that as we all know that America has closed its embassy in Moscow and has asked Americans to leave Russia. Okay, so his question is like, is this an indication that America wants to go one step ahead and enter the war if required in future? Okay, so what's your take on this?
I doubt that's actually what this is. If you see a few months ago, there's already been some kind of a issue with the US Embassy in Russia, essentially because what the Russian government had done is they had sort of banned, in a way, they had banned the US Embassy in Russia from employing locals, as in local people residing in Russia, from being employed in the embassy. So if you see why while a country establishes a mission in another country, that is the embassy, they employ a lot of local staff to run it, a certain operations. Now they can be as minuscule as sweeping and cleaning, and as high as people who are sort of employed to create an engagement in the country. Let's say in this case for US, they would hire a Russian to maybe increase the engagement with the Russian people. So when it comes to those kind of hirings, Russia has already sort of in put an unofficial ban on it, and that has created a lot of staffing problem in the US embassy, and they had been severely restricted to have the bare minimum people working there. So essentially, what US did was they started expelling by not granting visas to Russian diplomats, and the US congressmen have made out reports and called for US to expel more diplomats as long as Russia keeps up what it's doing essentially in Moscow. So this was more this move, as it comes amid the war, is not directly linked to the current war now, because the embassy is placed in Russia, which is a hostile territory currently, because a lot of the Russians have a perception, the ruling class has a perception of or Putin has a perception that America is indirectly responsible for this, whatever happened in Ukraine, the instigation that took place according to him. So it makes sense for them to not operate, because essentially why you have embassies in other countries is so to you for you to open a line of communication, open engagement. But in this case it wouldn't be possible. So I think that's more of a reason for this, rather than this being a prelude to in to US being militarily involved in the conflict. So essentially that's what I think it is.
Next question is from Naresh Manrekar. He's asking that why Vladimir Putin decided to go to war with Ukraine, and is it only to grow Russia's status? So, what do you think about it?
I think essentially that's the perception that the media has created in the West, that Putin is being aggressive and all those things. But my point is that there was a lot of passive aggression from the Ukrainians, in the sense that Russia has been a strong opponent of NATO, and they don't want NATO forces around their borders. So Ukraine being a neighboring country, it's a big no-no for them. So when you even just before the start of war, and even when the conflict was just about to break out, just 2 days before that, what Vladimir Zelensky had said is, for us to give up NATO is compromising with our future security. So for us, not having that option or giving up on that option is not an option at all, to be honest. So that kind of a thing had happened, and then Russia has this concept of creating a buffer state between them and the West. So essentially, in Indian context, would be, let's say Tibet exists as an independent country, we would have Tibetan soldiers on Arunachal and Ladakh border, and not Chinese soldiers. But because China annexed Tibet a few decades ago, you have Chinese soldiers, and then we have clashes like the ones that took place in Galwan, and then we have incidents that happened in Doklam. So essentially, it's about creating a buffer. What Russia has demanded, even in the first meeting that took place, one, you will remain neutral, And also his whole mission that you what Putin has championed it as a special operation that is meant to demilitarize Ukraine. That essentially means Ukraine will never have an army that will threaten Russia. And given the kind of scale Ukraine is, it's about 44 million people, if I'm not wrong, and Russia is about 150 million odd people. So that's one third of their population. So if Ukraine, given the kind of geography it has, the kind of size it has, the kind of resources it has, the kind of population it has, it can become a serious challenge to Russia in the future. So essentially, Ukraine, what Putin is trying to do is create a neutral zone in Ukraine where he is not very much opposed to their economic engagement with the West, but he is very much opposed to a military engagement with the West from the Ukrainians. So that's essentially what this is, I feel, and not about annexing Ukraine. Yes.
Ramra is asking that do you think Putin's stance towards United States has changed ever since he first assumed office as head of the state since the year 2000?
I think essentially what has happened is during the 1990s, Putin had a very bad experience being a Russian, and he's seen the way the West has tried to take advantage of a weakened Russia, and the way people have tried to, foster some dissent against the Russian leadership. So his first initial reaction was to consolidate power and then eventually go on the offensive, so to say. So he went on an offensive in Chechnya to prove that he is not a person who won't act, because the Chechenian first Chechenian war that took place, Boris Yeltsin had suffered some humiliation. But when it came to Putin, he had basically flattened Chechenian capital, Grozny, if I'm not wrong, and he essentially made a point there. And then same thing he did in Georgia, and then same thing he's doing with Ukraine. So his initial point was that he was open to engagement with the West, in the sense he's a very practical man. He's very strategic in his thinking, but he's also aware. He also harbors a deep distrust against the U.S. So he tried to engage with the West, but from his own personal experiences, he's described it as being something that they've broken his trust. They've not come through the way he wanted them to come through. So whenever he's engaged with the West, he's had a bad experience. So after what happened in Crimea, he realized that there's no point in trying to engage. He's gone on a different path altogether. He's had his own ideological epiphany of sorts. He wants to sort of lay a pathway or a roadmap for Russia for the next few decades, and he's building towards it. And he realizes that engagement with the West is not a part of it. So essentially, if you ask me, has his behavior changed? All these experiences have sort of shaped his perception of West, which is he's changed his stance towards US. So he was always mistrusting of the US, and right now, but he was strategically using it by not showing it overtly. Now he's essentially come out all in the open. So I think that's about.
So next we have got two questions which are similar in nature. Okay, first question from Khwaja Sultan who asked that why India is silent and when it comes to abstaining from resolution, does it suits India as a democratic country? And on similar lines, Dr. Amos Shirali also asked which way India uh, should align in Russian Ukraine crisis and what is the consequence if India goes the west side?
Okay, essentially, it all comes down to self-interest. International relations is all about self-interest. खुद अपना अपना देखो sort of kind of attitude. US pretty much practices it, and we have to sort of learn something from the West. That's one thing we should do. So, given the kind of history we have, the kind of relationship we have with the Russian Federation, it doesn't make sense for us to go out openly and oppose Russia. If we do, we import more than, I think, 80% of our weapons from Russia. If I'm not, it's about that. It's around that number only. So if we do, those weapons will become obsolete because Russia is not. If Russia under Putin, the kind of vengeance it's showing, If Russia decides that it wants to take vengeance on India, India will be in big trouble, and we can't replace our reliance on Russia essentially because it takes decades and decades to sort of get uh, new systems in place. So essentially, the kind of partnership we have, if we are going to buy S-400 from Russia and vote against Russia in the UN, I don't really know what kind of S-400s we can expect from them, or whether we can expect any at all. So essentially, it comes down to self-interest. Uh, but also, we have another way out where we can provide humanitarian aid to Ukrainian people, which the Russians anyways won't mind. So I think we can work our way out through this kind of diplomatic quagmire by, giving humanitarian aid to Ukraine at the same time showing diplomatic support to Russia by not support in directly opposing it, sort of. I think that would be better.
Okay, Shailesh, thank you for joining us today and sharing valuable insights.
Okay. Actually, it's been a pleasure being here, and thanks a lot again for the opportunity.